I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Papagiannis. I'm Managing Director at Economics 21. On behalf of Economics 21 and the Manhattan Institute, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the panelists, and I also want to thank our moderator, Chuck Lane, for participating today. Part of the mission of both organizations is to put on events or forums like this one to talk about big issues of the day, and public pensions, is there a crisis, is certainly one of those. I don't want to take too much time here in the intro, so I want to get into the discussion here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck and our panelists. Again, thank everybody for coming.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all, too. I look out over this room, and I am astonished at how many really hardcore policy wonks you can bring together still in Washington these days. And then I realize there's free food, so I have to discount for that. But I got to believe you're here because you're really interested. I know I am. This whole question of public finances of the states has produced a lot of drama in Wisconsin and Ohio and other locations around the country. And I know at the editorial board at the Post, we've been working a lot on trying to understand just what the risks and benefits are of the various competing ideas for how to structure public employee compensation going forward. I guess at the moment, the initiative on this issue is with the conservative critics of public employee pension programs, and they've pointed to studies that suggest very, very large unfunded liabilities, anywhere from $1 to $3 trillion, depending on whose estimates you like. But in recent months, I think there's been some pushback from folks who are saying, hey, wait a minute, this situation is being portrayed as more dire than it actually might be. And so, fortunately, the sponsors of our event today have brought together some pretty strong representatives of each point of view to have it out in front of you guys, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. I'll do some quick introductions, give you the rules of the debate, and then we'll get started. To my extreme left, physically but not ideologically, is Andrew Biggs, who's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a former principal deputy commissioner of the Social Security Administration. To my immediate left is Josh Barro, a Walter Wriston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he's been writing a lot about this issue recently. To my right, immediately to my right, is Elizabeth Mcnichol, Senior Fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, who specializes in state fiscal issues, and she's been analyzing the impact of pensions on state budgets. And to my very far right, definitely not ideologically, is Dean Baker, who's co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, author of numerous books, including his most recent one, Taking Economics Seriously, which I suppose he doesn't mind having plugged right here. Here's how we're going to do it. Each side of our panel will have a total of 10 minutes for introductory comments, divided equally between the two members of the panel on each side, and then there'll be about 20 or 30 minutes, I guess, of guided debate, guided by me. I'll try to keep the time organized well enough so that at the end we can have questions from the audience, which is always an interesting part of any panel. So we'll start with, these guys lost the coin toss, they have to go first. We'll start with Andrew Biggs, the American Enterprise Institute.
Well, thank you very much. I get the task of starting out, which is a little bit harder to do in 5 minutes because I feel I must do a little bit of intro. The debate over pension financing comes down to how the plans value their liabilities. The health of a pension plan depends on the size of its assets versus the size of its liabilities. The problem is the assets exist today, the liabilities exist years or decades in the future. So the question is, how do you translate these liabilities, these benefit payments that are owed years and years away from now, how do you translate them back to the present? The method that's used is what's called discounting. And discounting is sort of like compound interest in reverse. Compound interest, you take a dollar value today and you add interest to it every year to produce some future value. Discounting takes a future value, subtracts interest each year to produce a present value. So when you judge the finances of a plan, they compare the present value of the plan's liabilities to the value of the plan's assets. That gives you the funding ratio. It tells you the unfunded liabilities and things like that. The question or the debate is over which interest rate do you use to discount those future liabilities back to today. Under current methods that are set up by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, the pensions discount their future liabilities to the present at the interest rate they expect to earn on their assets, which is usually around 8%. The higher the interest rate, the higher the discount rate you use, the smaller the present value of your liabilities, the better funded your plan looks. So the pensions today base their discount rate upon the interest rate on their assets. Economists, on the other hand, are pretty much universal in saying the discount rate should be based upon the risk characteristics, not of the assets, but of the liability. If the liability is very, very safe, if it's guaranteed, if it has to be paid, then you discount it at a low interest rate. And so most economists who've looked at this have said, well, public pensions are effectively guaranteed even when governments have been essentially in default. They continue to pay these benefits. So let's treat them as if they're like a government bond. So they discount them back to the present at the government bond interest rate. That produces a much bigger liability, and the plans look much worse funded. Using this approach is called market valuation. Public pensions aren't around 75 or 80% funded as they claim to be. They're really around 40 or 45% funded. Just to give some context, the Department of Labor says that any private plan that's less than 65% funded would be considered in critical condition. By that measure, there are maybe 1 or 2 pensions around the country that aren't in critical condition. Recently, just the Congressional Budget Office came out with an analysis of this, and which was perceived as siding with the market valuation side of things. And the core difference, the core argument on this is that the folks who side with this current actuarial method, they view the government as sort of an entity in itself. The economists say government, like a corporation, is a pass-through entity, that it passes risk and rewards on to various stakeholders, who can include taxpayers, bondholders, public employees, beneficiaries of government plans, etc. So if you're valuing the risk, if you're valuing the liabilities of the plan, you value it not the way some anthropomorphized government values it. You value it the way the stakeholders value it. And that's using this market value approach. And that the reason you do this is that the costs and the benefits aren't borne by the government, they're borne by individuals. If we look at what's going on around the country today, where pensions are underfunded, we've had to increase contributions, we have to cut other programs, it's not the government that bears that risk, it's individuals who bear it. So the key logic here is that you value these risks the way individuals do. So the CBO has essentially come out and endorsed this. It really is, I mean, it's great to debate the back and forth, but to be very clear, though, this is how economists view valuation liabilities. This is how financial markets value liabilities. A financial market doesn't care about the assets you have set aside to fund a liability. They care about how big is it, how certain is it to be paid. And this is also consistent with how private pensions value their liabilities. A private pension is allowed to invest in stocks if it wants to, and most do, but they are not allowed to credit themselves with a return on high risky investments before the risk has borne out.
Andrew,
time? Okay, we'll leave it at that then. Thank you.
Josh, you can pick up where he left off.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the size of these liabilities is having direct impacts on local government and state government budgets in the short and medium term. And there are 2 points you often hear against the idea that there's a pension crisis. The first is that pension costs are a relatively small part of government, state and local costs, about 3.8% of state budgets and local budgets. And the other is that state and local governments have 30 years over which to deal with unfunded liabilities under GASB rules. And so the scope of the problem being limited and you having a long time to deal with it, it's not a crisis, it's something that you can manage. And I would contend that those points are ultimately incorrect. First of all, that 3.8% figure is a backward-looking number. It's looking at what governments were contributing into pensions over the last several years, including contributions made based on calculations that do not reflect stock market declines during the recession. First of all, some funds weren't even paying what they were supposed to at this point anyway. New Jersey famously made no pension payment whatsoever last year. And so when you look at that 3.8% statistic, it's looking like pension benefits were free in Jersey, which really they weren't. So if you bump that up, you get somewhere closer to 5%. But then the bigger issue is that funds all over the country are seeing substantial increases in their required payments because of poor performance of their investment portfolios. The unfunded liability of a pension fund is an awful lot like a 30-year mortgage in that you don't just have to repay the principal amount that's unfunded. You have to pay interest on it because the calculations that underlie pension accounting assume an 8% or roughly an 8% return on investments. And if those investments aren't really in the fund, you need to make it up as an interest payment. So it's like a mortgage, but it's an 8% mortgage, not a mortgage at an interest rate that the government could actually borrow at. The first-year payment on a $100,000 8% 30-year mortgage wouldn't be about 1/30th of the mortgage balance. It's in fact nearly a tenth of it. You'd pay 8.9% of the mortgage balance in the first year in principal and interest payments. And so even though it's a 30-year horizon you have to make it up, it has significant short-term effects on the budget. Good rule of thumb is that, and it'll depend on the specific characteristics of a pension fund, but if you saw a fully funded pension fund go to about a 75% funding ratio, and it's using 30-year amortization, its annually required payment would roughly double. Now let's think about what's actually happened in terms of investment portfolios of pension funds. We don't have the latest data reflecting the stock market uptick over the last 18 months or so from the pension funds, but we can sort of guess where they've ended up. The total return on the S&P 500 over the last 5 years is about 3%. And a typical pension fund is about 70% invested in equities, and they actually need to achieve about a 10% return on those equities to get to an 8% return overall. So assuming that they're 7% short on average over the last 5 years on those equity returns, you should see, in fact, on average, about a 25-point decline in the funding ratio of those pension funds once everything's shaken out, and assuming they continue on their expected investment trend going forward. So doublings and triplings of current year pension costs in state and local governments shouldn't be aberrant. That should be the standard that you're seeing around the country. In some places, it's going to be even worse. For example, because a pension fund invested particularly poorly, or because a pension fund has a state obligation to amortize more quickly than in 30 years, which you see, for example, in New York State. And so in those places, you'll see even more acute pressure on state budgets. Now, can a doubling of those costs be something that can be handled by state governments all around the country? So if we were at nearly 4, but we're really at nearly 5, if you count what we should be paying, and now we're at nearly 10, if that were the only problem, yes, it would be a serious concern, but it would be something that states could manage through. The trouble is that it's coming at a time when state and local budgets are under severe pressure for all sorts of reasons. And furthermore, that's by design. Because pension funds are invested in equities and have investment pools that are therefore heavily correlated with the overall performance of the economy, when they will do poorly will tend to be when state governments can least afford to make up those kinds of payments. So, for example, Newark, New Jersey went from paying $37 million into pension funds in 2009 to $62 million in 2010 on a city budget of around $500 million. If that were the only trouble facing Newark, they could probably handle that. But because of the weak economy and pressure on state aid to cities and the difficulty of relying more on a property tax base at a time when the economy is weak, they're not in a good position to handle that.
Josh, you got about 10 seconds.
So because of that, that's exactly why you should think of government as not having a special ability to handle risk. When poor investment returns come, it's going to result in situations precisely like this.
Thank you, Josh. We're going to turn to Elizabeth now.
Thanks. And as Josh sort of let in, I'm going to talk about why I think that the pension crisis is overstated, and that first, pension costs clearly aren't driving the state's current short-term fiscal problems because they only make up 3.8% of budgets. And despite what you're hearing, the current problems are manageable and states have begun to manage them. The trust funds as they exist now contain enough money to pay benefits for 4 decades. Most states face the cyclical operating deficits for the next year or two, and that's going to continue. There are pressures, but it is a cyclical problem. The pension funding, on the other hand, is different in nature. Since 2000, we've had 2 recessions that reduced the value of assets in pension trust funds, and it made it hard for some jurisdictions to make their full payments. The average funding level using the actuarial assumptions that state pension funds use dropped from about 100% in 2000 on average to 75 or 80% now. And there are a small number of states and local governments that are in considerably worse shape because they skipped payments when times were good, or they increased benefits retroactively without putting additional funding into the fund. Now, under standard pension accounting rules promulgated by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board and looked at by bond rating agencies, the states don't have to bring the trust funds back to 100% funding all at once, and that they can set aside money over the course of 30 years, based on their assumptions about investment returns, not just dividing it up into 30 equal payments. There's a study by Boston College of what it would take for states to bring their pension trust funds or trust funds back up to full funding, and the amount they would have to contribute would increase from 3.8% to about 5% of their budgets. Again, assuming the rate of return on the funds that are in the trust fund. And that's an increase of about 1% of budgets, which is a problem, but it's manageable. And states and local governments have contributed at that level in the past. In the 70s, when they were building their funds up to the current level, and there's right now about $3 trillion in these trust funds, they were contributing about 5.5% of budgets. Now, you have to make a distinction between measuring pension liability on a balance sheet and using this economist view, and the amount that state and local governments have to contribute each year, how much they have to set aside to have on hand to grow in their trust fund so that they have enough money to pay those pension benefits when they come due. And the CBO report that was referred to earlier references that distinction, says that this measuring liability can inform these decisions, but there is a distinction between what you have to contribute and how going forward. Pension funds do invest in a diversified basket of private securities. Then going back, those have earned over 8% in the past. It may be that they are. Many states are looking at those assumptions. Maybe 8% is too high. Let's look at our basket. Let's look at what we think is going to happen in the future. Maybe we need to lower it some. But going down to just 4%, it seems very unlikely that given the market basket of investments that going forward we're going to get just 4% returns. And as you can see from reading about the stock market, returns have begun to come back. If you base the annual state contribution to pension funds on that return to riskless rate, it really seems to go much further than necessary. Pension funds adjust for the long term, so you can average out the bad years with the good years. A private sector business can go out of business. The governments are going to be around, so they can average things out. And there are significant downsides to using too low a rate. If you put money into the pension fund now that you don't really need to because it's going to grow, that takes money away from other important needs, education, health care, paying off debt, building up trust funds. If you assume a 4 or 5% discount rate, interest rate, and make contributions based on that, then trust funds will build up when they get bigger returns. And we've seen in the past that means that states and local governments tend to skip contributions or give increased benefits that they can't necessarily afford. So that's a problem. So just to conclude, pension funds don't face a liquidity crisis now.
Well, that's okay. You can
Can I
finish
say
that
my last
sentence.
sentence?
Yes.
The existing trust funds, on average, would pay benefits even if they didn't pay down the unfunded liability for 15 to 30 years. So they have time to deal with this problem.
Okay, Dean Baker.
Okay, thanks. I want to make two main points. First off, that pensions it's appropriate for them to assume an 8% return now. That is, in fact, the expected value going forward. I'm going to say that was not true in times past. I'm very glad that we have Joe and Andrew getting on about excessive return assumptions. I wish they'd been there 10 and 15 years ago, but better late than never. The second point is I want to talk a little bit about the consequences. What do it mean? What do we think would logically happen if we use these lower return assumptions? First, just let me quickly jump on a couple points that Andrew and Josh had made. Liz already responded to Andrew's point, but just to emphasize this, there is a qualitative distinction between private plans and the government in that we don't expect governments to go out of business. We saw that even a company like General Motors can go bankrupt, so there is a sense that there can be a tomorrow where General Motors isn't there. Obviously, I suppose in principle governments can go out of business, but we don't generally see that or think about that. The other point, Josh was talking about the current downturn. Yes, this is a very, very bad downturn. I think we have to be realistic about what you plan for. If we go back, those of you who are from D.C., 2010, we had a really bad winter. We had, by my counting, 3 or 4 very large snowstorms. I think we would be out of our gourd if we sat around planning for 3 or 4 major snowstorms in D.C. every year. We'd be wasting a lot of money on snow clearing equipment. And I think that would get us where that would be the equivalent to assuming a risk-free rate of return in this context. Okay, very quickly, why am I saying that 8% return is appropriate going forward? Let's just boil down a few things. What we're talking about is the correct return on the stocks that are held by these funds, because we're not arguing over bond returns. The question is, we have, on the one hand, stocks, which we know are somewhat risky assets. What return should you assume? Well, in effect, that comes to 10% nominal, 7% real. I would argue that's appropriate going forward precisely because the market has fallen. I've been on panels with people and they go, oh, the return's been real bad. That's right. The stock market has fallen. Returns going forward depend on current price-to-earnings ratio. If you assumed a 7% real return on stock in the late 90s, you were crazy. A lot of people did that. Pension funds did that. That was crazy. We had price-to-earnings ratios of 30 to 1. There was no way you could do it. We had the no economists left behind test. We said, show it. No one could. They'd have to put down numbers that were embarrassing. Even in the last decade, when you had P's over 20, it didn't make sense. In the current situation, we have price-to-earnings, price against trend earnings of around 14 to 1. Earnings, in effect, are 7% of price. 7% return is very appropriate. We have a calculator on our website. We encourage you to go there and figure out what sort of growth assumptions or price-to-earnings ratios you would need to assume to get something like the risk-free rate of return. It's simply not a plausible assumption. Okay, so I would argue, A, that this is the expected rate of return. It's really not plausible to have a return over a long period that's substantially below that. What's the consequence of assuming a lower rate of return? Let's tell everyone you have to assume a risk-free rate of return. All right, so we have people managing these funds. They have to assume a risk-free rate of return on their assets. Stocks are risky. Okay, so, well, are they going to do that? Let's say they continue to hold risky stocks and they give the return that we expect, the expected value, 7% real return. They assume roughly a 3% return, a risk-free rate of return. Well, we get exactly the story Liz was talking about. They'd be accumulating assets. So do we think it makes sense to pre-fund pensions? We don't pre-fund education. We don't pre-fund the fire department. Why would you do that with pensions? In other words, why would we have extra funding today so that 5 or 10 years out we could tell everyone you could pay less into pensions? Again, great gift to our kids, but it never occurs to us to do that with any other area of public expenditure. And it just, to my mind, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Tax people more today so that our children and grandchildren will pay less taxes. We usually do this as, people should pay the taxes based on the services they're accruing. Okay, the other story, let's say, okay, you have people managing the pension funds who are saying, we could only assume a risk-free rate of return on our stock, even though it's risky. Well, they might reasonably decide, well, since we're only being credited with a risk-free rate of return, why don't we actually hold an asset that holds less risk? In other words, hold government bonds. What does that mean? That would mean lower returns for the pension funds. So that means for the same pension that public employees get, you'd have to have higher taxes. Why on earth would you want to raise people's taxes? Why would you not want to take advantage of the opportunity to hold a more risky asset that gives a higher expected rate of return? And I just love, as we have this debate, there's sort of a parallel debate on Social Security. I saw that my good friend Martin Feldstein is still arguing in the Washington Post that we want to get people out of Social Security into the stock market as individuals, and guess what rate of return he's assuming? It's not the risk-free one. So let's just get on the same planet. Governments are long-lived. The worst thing that happens to state governments when you have a period where the market's down is you have forums like this where people say they should cut their pensions. They could live with that.
Thank you, Dean. And I'm going to give you guys one or the other, or maybe both, brief chance to respond to what you've heard. They'll respond, and then I'm going to throw in a question or two.
Well, maybe I'll just start with Dean's comments, because I like listening to Dean. He's a very smart guy, always very interesting. But basically, it's just non-responsive to the arguments that economists and the CBO and all them made. The argument made under market valuation is not that the assets in the fund are going to return 4%. That is not the argument. The argument is that the way you value an asset, the discount rate you apply to the asset, or to the liability, the discount rate applied to the liability is a function of the liability, not of the asset that funds it. That's just simply fundamental. So I'm not disagreeing with Dean that stocks may return 8% on average. I think that's fine. What I'm disagreeing with is they're not going to return it without risk. The liability coming from public pensions is without risk, and you have to account for that. You simply have a false comparison between the risk of the assets, which are risky, and the risk of the liability, which is guaranteed. So it's an interesting argument. It is utterly non-responsive to the argument that economists are making.
Yeah, I'm actually, when I hear Dean make this argument, and I wrote about this after he put his paper out, I'm struck that he's in the public policy business, because since Dean has discovered that the stock market is substantially mean reverting and that you can predict future performance of it based on past performance, he should quit and go to the hedge fund business and make a ton of money. Basically, the conceit is that you can be confident about this 8% return in the long term, and so because the government is unconstrained in its ability to wait around for investments to come back and get back on that trend line, then there's no reason to worry about that risk. But that's untrue for two reasons. One is that we don't know that 8% rate of return is true for the future. We could have a long-term reduction, or for that matter, a long-term increase in the rate of economic growth that would then substantially impact those equity returns in the long term. That risk gets manifested back to taxpayers, that they are taking on this risk that may prove unaffordable in poor economic scenarios, which are the times that they're going to be least able to afford to make that up. And furthermore, for the reasons that I sketched out before, the cyclical changes matter too, because when you accrue those unfunded liabilities, you have to pay interest on the unfunded liability, and that ends up being quite expensive. The final thing I would note is that none of these arguments about why the government has a special ability to invest in equities have any relationship to the fact that the government is providing pension benefits to its employees. A pension fund is a vehicle through which a government makes long-term promises to workers and through which it invests in stocks and bonds, but those activities are fundamentally separable. You could have a totally unfunded pension plan, and in fact, many states have had those in the past. And furthermore, you could have a sovereign wealth fund that invests assets and then just takes the returns and uses them for the benefit of taxpayers to finance government rather than for a specific purpose. So if these arguments are right and the government does have a special ability to achieve risky investment returns without concern for the risk that it's incurring, then the government really should just go out and buy as much stock up as it can. Just issue bonds like crazy, take them, invest in equities, capture this 10% equity return, pay 5% interest on the bonds, and it's just free money for taxpayers. Obviously, the problem with that arises with the fact that the risk isn't, in fact, inconsequential. It matters to taxpayers. But if the risk really were inconsequential, that would be a pretty clear upshot of the argument, that really you want the government owning as much equity as it can. And I think that ends up being a pretty perverse outcome.
Okay, guys.
Sure. I feel from listening to Andrew and Josh that I'm in jeopardy of having my economist card take away from me. Now, of course, given that this is a profession that totally missed the housing bubble, maybe that wouldn't be a bad thing. Look, just to get back to what we're trying to focus on here, we could argue about accounting principles, but the basic point is, what is the implications for the government? And what I've argued here is, given current price-to-earnings ratios, it is very hard to come up with a remotely plausible scenario where you get long-term returns over the next 30 years, that are qualitatively lower than the 7% real returns that pension funds are assuming. If you look back over the post-war period, take whatever decade you like, there's not that much variation in growth, and in no case were our growth projections all that far from what actually turned out to be the case. So again, we don't know the future. I mean, even our government bonds at the end of the day could end up being worthless. But the idea that we're going to have a story where over the next 30 years, growth is qualitatively worse. I'm not talking about 1/10, 2/10, 3/10 of a percentage point less. That really will not matter at all. But the idea that somehow instead of having, let's say, average growth, I think the projection is roughly 2.5%, it's going to be 1.5%. That's very hard to imagine. And frankly, if that were the case, we would have much greater concerns than our pension funds. So I don't think, we're taking extraordinary risk here. Again, the argument, as I say, that you could have 2, 3, 4 years, and this is why I'm not in the investment world. I don't know exactly what those 2, 3, 4 years will be. I feel much more confident talking about 20 or 30 years, and it was easy to see in the 1990s that the stock bubble wasn't going to stay there forever. More economists should have seen that, but they didn't. But if you start some fairly simple arithmetic, I think you could feel fairly safe in assuming 7% real returns. Won't be exactly right, but it's very hard to see how it's going to be too far from the mark.
I think we need to bring back the 2 points, as Judge said. The trust funds are a different way of financing a state expense than from other parts of the budget. And there's a real good policy reason for that states and the taxpayers are trying to figure out the cost of a public employee at the time that the public employee is employed and that people are paying. So you need to figure out an estimate of, we're promising this person a pension 20 years from now. What do we need to set aside now to be able to pay that pension? Because then it brings that future cost into the present, and the current taxpayers are then paying that current cost. So my main argument with using the risk-free rate rather than what you might actually expect to get from the monies that you're putting into this fund, is that you'll then set aside more money that the current taxpayers pay than they need to in order to fund that future cost. So I don't want to say that there's no problem. There is a problem. It's just very, very far from the crisis that these figures are being used to portray it as. State and local governments are going to be around for the long term. They can make incremental changes. Trying to say we need to pay, whether it's $700 billion, which the current investment returns would get you as a total unfunded liability, or $3 trillion, sort of saying you need to make those funds whole tomorrow, leads you to the idea that states and local governments can't afford their pensions. But in fact, pensions play a role in attracting people. If you set money aside and let it earn interest, if you lower those benefits when it looks like there's not going to be enough money in there over time, or lower the interest assumptions, then they can manage their way through this. It's not that immediate crisis that this leads people to portray the pension situation as.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to throw out a question to both sides, because I want to try and bring what's been a very illuminating discussion of the problem of the discount rate to try and address a slightly different question, which is, why do we have these pensions in the first place? And Elizabeth has touched on that. She's basically arguing it's a kind of deferred compensation. Another way to put that question would be, is it worth it or necessary to assume a certain amount of risk in the future? If we absolutely have to have pensions at a certain level in order to get qualified people to staff our state and local governments, you might say, well, okay, I'll take that risk at 8%, but if you could have them a lot cheaper and you don't need to take that risk, then I might say, well, let's go that way, or maybe scrap pensions altogether. On top of that, I think a lot of what is feeding the perception of a crisis are a lot of stories about people who accrue enormous pensions. These are probably the exceptions, but they're not unusual, these 6-figure and so forth. So I'd like to get each side to address the question of whether this form of deferred compensation is still as valuable and relevant to states and local governments as it has been said to be in the past, and if not, what are the alternatives?
I think the fact that public employers still use DB, or let's say that the fact that they use DB plans to begin with, I think is
that's defined benefit.
Defined benefit plans rather than a 401k structure, is because they began these pensions at a time when 401k defined contribution plans weren't very prevalent. So they went with the only pension they could really use at that point. The question is, does this really make sense going forward? I guess I would make 2 points. One is there's a debate over whether we should use this so-called market valuation for looking at the employer's cost, or the government's cost for these plans. There should be no debate that you should use that approach if you're valuing the benefits that individuals are getting. And if you look at the benefits that public pensions provide, they're really very, very generous relative to those provided by private sector employers through 401k plans. I could run through it, but they're really quite generous. The question is whether this DB approach really makes sense. The argument is that because the annual accruals are highest later in life for employees. They don't get very much in the opening years, but later in life it really makes sense to stay on, and so it encourages longevity and loyalty and all that. I'm just not really sure whether that makes sense in a lot of cases. Do I want, if you're a 50-year-old or 45-year-old, you'd be a fool to leave a DB plan because you're really kicking into the accruals at that rate. Do I want a 50-year-old firefighter carrying me out of a building because he's saying, well, I can't afford to leave? Likewise, if you look at the research that's been done on productivity of teachers, they tend to improve most in the first 5 or even 10 years of their working careers. After that, their quality of teaching levels off, sometimes even declines if they get burned out. But again, a burned out teacher will be a fool to leave because the accruals are so heavy once they get to kind of mid-career. I think with the DC approach, people who wanted to leave could leave. They could take that money with them, and that would encourage, I think, greater sort of shifting in and out of public service, which I think would be good for the private sector and for public service alike.
Let's go over to the side.
Well, one thing is what we're talking about here with liabilities is the unfunded liabilities of plans, so the money that they don't have in the trust funds. If you switch now from defined benefit to defined contribution, it does nothing for that issue. So it doesn't solve the current problem of how states pay down those unfunded liabilities. But going back to the issue of compensation, careful studies that look at the pay of teachers and other public employees that can control for education, for tenure, find that their pay on its own is lower than for comparable private sector jobs, so that the benefits that they get help to fill in that gap. And also, defined benefit plans are a more efficient way of providing retirement security for employees, private or public sector. The pooling that happens, the administrative costs are lower for providing a pension that way, or providing retirement payments in the future through defined benefit rather than through defined contribution.
Did you? Yeah, let's go to Josh and then back to you.
Okay.
Regarding those studies, and Andrew is the author of some studies on this, but just briefly, the problem with those comparisons is that they don't properly value the retirement benefits. On the pension side, they're counting it again based on this 8% discount rate. So again, you can talk about what needs to be funded, but the value to the employee, the employee gets real value out of the lack of risk in that in the pension benefit. And so if you value that like a safe investment you would need to match that lack of risk, the value of the benefit becomes significantly higher and the compensation package larger. Retiree health benefits are not included at all in those studies because of a limitation in the data that is created by the Census Bureau. So when you adjust for those two, you go from finding approximate parity to finding a significant pay and benefits advantage in the public sector. The other thing I'd note is there are two possible reasons why you might give out these benefits. One is that it's efficient for attracting talent, and the other is as a public policy idea that these are good kinds of benefits that people should have. On the first count, there was a very interesting study out of Stanford of a pension sweetener that was given out to Illinois teachers in the late 90s. Basically, they got a larger benefit going forward, and then going backward, they could pay to have it as though they were accruing that benefit for the entirety of their career. And it was kind of structured in a way that was an economic researcher's dream, where nearly everybody was going to get a good deal for taking that buy-up. 99% of teachers would get a 7% or better guaranteed annual return on the amount that they're using to do the buy-up, and they were allowed to take it as a payroll deduction over time, so it wasn't like they were liquidity constrained as to whether they could buy up. In practice, many chose not to take that option, and it varied depending on how long you'd been around and what your salary was. In some cases, the deal was much more generous than a 7% return. And the finding was that on average, they were willing to pay less than 20% 20% of the present value of the pension benefit in order to get that sweetener. That's using a market value discount rate. If you used the 8% discount rate in the funds, you would be finding something more like they would only pay 40% of the amount. But what's clear there is, in general, it's less efficient to compensate employees in benefits than in cash because they might not value the benefit as much as it costs to provide. And I think that's a pretty clear example that a lot of public employees don't value their pension benefits as much as it costs to provide them. And that makes a fair amount of sense. Having a pension is kind of like having an annuity. Not a lot of people invest in annuities during their work life.
Thanks, Josh. Go back to Dean.
Yeah, a few points here. First off, you'd raised the issue about some of the coverage, and I think a lot of the media coverage has been very irresponsible. I remember the Washington Post had a front-page piece where it talked about this guy in California who supposedly was getting $500,000 a year as a pension, and it turned out the guy was actually under indictment. He had given himself many different jobs as city manager, city administrator, this and that. That's not the typical pension. The typical pensions you're talking about are in the order of $2,000 to $3,000 a month, and in many cases, roughly 30% public employees are not covered by Social Security. So this is their whole retirement income. So, that's not to say you don't have some overly generous pensions, but that's certainly not the case for the typical employee. Now, in terms of the basic logic of DB plans, it's sort of funny because when I was in grad school, I remember learning about this. I really didn't ever occur to me it was going to be such a controversial position. We were taught that, DB plans made sense from the standpoint of large employers that were relatively indifferent to risk, the risk year by year in the stock market, as opposed to individuals where it makes an enormous difference. Point being that when I retire, by the way, Andrew, I think I'm over 50, but I think I could still carry you out of a building. But in any case, when I retire, when I turn 65, whatever age I stop working, if the market happens to be down, I'm out of luck. So if it's a question of, what do you have at that point, and you're in a down market, you're out of luck. On the other hand, if my employer is some major company or a state, a public entity, they could get through a 2, 3, 4 year period of a down stock market. So the point was that the entity that can more easily bear risk does that, and in effect that's giving something free to the employee that they value greatly and is offset in other compensation. And just to raise Josh's point, I think it's appropriate. He's saying if we use a risk-free rate of return, we find out that employees are getting very generous benefits. If we look at what states actually pay, then they're not getting very generous benefits. It's very comparable and perhaps somewhat less, done by a number of analyses, including my colleague John Schmidt. It's somewhat less than what employees with comparable education experience get in the private sector.
Okay, we're almost out of time for the meeting, so I'd like to see if there are any folks in the audience who have been burning to ask a question. Now's your chance. Anybody? Yes, sir, in the front. There's a microphone coming. Please introduce yourself.
My name's Steve Kreisberg. I'm with AFSCME. I had a question for Andrew. I think, if I heard you correctly, you're saying you don't really take issue with the 8% rate of return in terms of a diversified portfolio, but for you, it's a matter of how you value the liability, and so it's really an accounting issue. But if we create accounting reports that show liability is greater than we're going to pay, how does that help from a public policy aspect? And then I'd like Dean's response to that.
Sure. Well, you raise a good point, and Liz has raised this as well, saying, okay, maybe you're technically right in terms of valuing the liability, but as I think we both sides now agree, there's a distinction between how you value the liability and how you fund it. And so, is this really just kind of an argument over nothing, that we could put some accounting statement but still fund the way we're currently funding? And I guess in theory you could. But there's two things that go on with public sector defined benefit pensions. There's two principles they work on. The first is understood, which is the benefit has to be guaranteed. There's a second principle that the DB plans and GASB endorses, which is called intergenerational or interperiod equity. What that means is that in any period, you should fully fund the benefits accruing in that period, and you shouldn't pass on a liability to future generations, future taxpayers. Now, when you put those two together, it gives you a different picture of things, of how you should value the liability and how you should invest for the liability. Because the reason is, let's say you have a guaranteed benefit liability in the future, and you invest enough today to cover that if you get an 8% return. Well, we know you're not going to get exactly 8%. Maybe you'll get more, maybe you'll get less. The insight of financial economics and financial markets is that the periods in which you come up short are a lot more valuable to people than the periods in which you come out ahead. And this is how, if you look at pricing of put options or kind of an insurance policy against falling short, it shows exactly that. So if you have a guaranteed benefit liability that has to be honored in the future and you're funding it with a risky asset, you are passing on a contingent liability to future generations, which is exactly contrary to this period of intergenerational equity. Financial economics doesn't say, here's how you should fund a liability. For that, you need some outside criterion called an objective function, which says, okay, here are the goals we have. But GASB has that goal. It's interperiod equity, which means you fully fund the liability when it's accrued, and you don't pass on a liability to the future. That means valuing the liability correctly and investing correctly so that you're not passing off big risks. People are carrying those risks today. People took risk in the past, and people today are paying higher taxes. They're having their services cut because of that. So that's the price we're trying to avoid people paying.
Dean, very quickly, please, so we can get another question in.
Okay, well, again, I think this gets back to the fact that governments can bear risk. They don't suffer the same problem that individuals do when the market's down because the government's going to be there. And again, I respect this idea of intergenerational equity, that if it's the case we use a too low rate of return, we're taxing people more today so that, 10 years out you'll be paying lower taxes in the future. I don't see the sense in that.
Any other questions? Yes, sir, in the front. By the way, I made a mistake. We're going to 1:30. Is that right, Kasia? Okay. So relax. Ask all the questions you want. In fact, I'm going to ask a couple. Okay. Could you please identify yourself?
Yes, Bill Sweetnam from the Groom Law Group. In private pension plans, if you are in critical status, you have to tell your employees about the critical status. And one thing that you guys really didn't touch on is what are the participants? What should the participants know about the funding status of their plan, and there you really, the interest rate really does matter too. So could you sort of respond to that? I mean, what should we be telling participants about the future of their retirement benefits?
I guess I'd say it's not clear what the risk is to public employees in plans that are underfunded. I mean, the risk in the private sector is that your company goes bankrupt and you get thrown into the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation and you get a significant reduction to your benefits. So private employees have clear, important reasons to think it's important that their pension plans be funded. In the public sector, where the plans are guaranteed by taxpayers, the limits on the guarantee of the benefit are political and to some extent legal, rather than the beneficiaries really directly relying on the investment pools in these funds. So I think, in general, we've seen in Vallejo, California, for example, pensions being honored ahead of municipal bonds. Which suggests that bondholders might have very little reason to care about solvency because they will have such priority in reorganizations. On the other hand, you've seen a few states that have made changes to cost of living formulas, even though their plans are not yet empty, but they are facing some distress. And so that's going to go through some court challenges in places like Colorado and Minnesota. So depending on how that shakes out, it is possible that having a plan that is poorly enough funded exposes public employees to political risk of loss of benefits in the future. And I think that'll be especially acute in places like Illinois and certain municipalities in Illinois. With regard to there being a pension crisis, there's not a pension crisis everywhere. It varies from location to location, and it also depends on what economic performance looks like in the future. But especially if economic performance is relatively poor over the next decade, in certain places where pensions are relatively poorly funded, you're going to need very painful adjustments to make the pension systems work again, and I think it's politically likely that part of that will be haircuts to pensioners in certain places.
Did somebody, yeah.
I mean, I'm certainly in favor of there being reports that let the taxpayers and let the public employees know the funded status of their plans, and they exist. I mean, pension funds have to put out reports, but I do think they should accurately portray the fiscal state, whether the state or local government will be able to make the contributions that they need based on the returns they're going to get in the trust fund. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB, sets up the rules to use for those things, and they're in the middle of a very long study of what rate of return or what discount rate the fund should use to put those reports together, and have concluded that the risk-free rate is not what makes sense for the assets that are in the trust fund, and that the rate of return is fine for those assets, and then a somewhat lower rate for the portion of benefits you would have to pay out after the assets in the trust fund have been run through.
Another question in the back. And again, please introduce yourself.
Frank Tedesco with the GAO. On the question of whether DB plans or defined benefit plans are still appropriate, Andrew pointed to the backloading nature of them, where so much of the benefit is earned in the last 10 or so years of service. And I think it is important to point out that if that is a concern, and it's an issue not just from a workforce management point of view, but for individuals who do change jobs, it has a big effect on what they ultimately end up with. But if that's the concern, the choice is not just between traditional DB and going to 401k. There are intermediate choices in between. You can design a defined benefit plan which doesn't have the traditional degree of backloading. The technical term is something like a career average plan with indexing. So we don't actually see them, but there are those intermediate policy options.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, one quick point I make, which I think is an interesting thing, comparing DB and DC plans. I mean, when you look at them up front, you say, well, the great thing about a DB is you're not bearing the market risk. With a 401k plan, you are bearing the risk. And that's, I mean, I've got some DB plan coming to me from my work in the federal government. I'm happy with that. But DB plans have a different kind of risk, which is if you leave your job in the middle of your career, if you're fired, or if the company shuts down, or if you have to move with your family, having two 20-year periods of working in DB plans, you get a lot less than if you had one 40-year period. So cutting off, you're changing jobs mid-career is a huge problem under a DB plan. It's not that big a problem under a DC plan because you simply take your assets from one place and shift them to the next. So there are pros and cons of each of these.
I'd just quickly like to comment that, I think this is a debate we should be having about restructuring DB plans instead of, unfortunately, in many cases, there's this debate about eliminating them, because I do think it's a problem that you have this backloading that, that probably provides very perverse incentives. Maybe in another era that was a good idea. It's analogous with Social Security. You have the spousal benefit that, when you had this model of the stay-home mom, which is totally antiquated, and you could probably get almost everyone in Congress to sign on saying at least modify that, if not eliminate that, but because there's an effort to totally overhaul the system, that's not done. So I think there's very good ways in which defined benefit plans could be modified that would benefit, both the public and probably the vast majority of workers that unfortunately are not being debated seriously right now.
Another question. Gentleman right here.
Joe Hinchman from the Tax Foundation. Just following on to what Dean just said, earlier Liz raised the point that in good times, in good times when things are flush, states have a tendency to award extra benefits that they don't put aside money for, that they can't afford. She's right, it happens a lot. Isn't that an inherent deficiency in defined benefit plans that you just don't get in defined contribution plans?
Excuse me, your point being that it's the size of the benefit that's collectively bargained for that is driving this crisis to some extent.
To some degree, but also the tendency just from political economy of when times are flush,
right.
handing out double benefits or double dipping or stuff like that.
Right. Okay.
This is why I wanted these guys yelling about excessive return assumptions back in the 90s. They had totally unrealistic expectations about returns back when you had price-to-earnings ratios of the stock market 30-1. There was no way on earth you were going to get 7% real returns going forward, and that was true in the last decade as well. Unfortunately, no one was talking about that other than me and a few other cranks.
I'm glad Dean has grouped himself in the cranks. I'm going to let Elizabeth go, and then we'll go back to you guys.
Yeah. I mean, I think it speaks to the disclosure that you need to have really good figures on what it actually costs. I think one thing where both sides agree on, or at least in the past, is that it doesn't make sense to give retroactive increases because by definition you haven't been contributing the normal cost through the years, and so that sets you up for problems in the future. I also think there may be reforms to the funding formulas that are separate from whatever discount rate you're using, that states should be putting in a minimum amount even when the calculation would say the contribution can be zero because we're 100% funded. So part of the smoothing process may be that you need to be putting money in the good times as well as in the bad times.
First, I'd just like to say, I hear Dean's pain about me not yelling loud enough about excessive returns in the late 90s. I tell him I was a sophomore in high school in 1998, and I tried to tell my social studies teacher, but he wouldn't listen to me. But I think what Joe hits on is a real structural public choice problem with these plans. Generally, state and local governments are not supposed to borrow money to fund current operations, and every state except Vermont has a balanced budget provision with varying strength, but it's pretty much true that states pay for their current operations with current revenues. But this is probably the biggest avenue for backdoor borrowing in states is either not funding your pension contribution or handing out pension sweeteners that are unfunded, and they're just inevitably going to be very tempting for lawmakers. Now, you could structure around that. Maine has a constitutional amendment that prohibits unfunded pension sweeteners. That's a good provision that really should be in every state constitution, and it would make defined benefit pensions significantly less problematic. There would be other problems that would remain, including the fundamental shift of investment risk from public employees to taxpayers, but that would make them significantly less problematic. I think politically it would be very challenging to get that done in the states because it's a forward-thinking reform. Banning unfunded sweeteners doesn't improve your funding ratio now. Public employee unions have excellent reason to oppose such reforms because they would hope to achieve unfunded sweeteners in the future. So if that reform could be made, I think it would improve DB pensions, but I'm not optimistic that it can actually get done in lots of places.
If I can touch quickly on Joe's questions, I think this gets to a very good issue of how the accounting is linked to sort of the political economy issues. The accounting says literally the more risk you take, the better funded you are. I mean, if we put all our money in stocks today, this alleged pension underfunding would go away according to GASB rules. Now that's nutty. I mean, it's just wrong because it just says you're taking more risk with your money, but that's how the accounting works. But that does mean that you're going to put more money in stocks. And when you put more money in stocks, it means you're going to have more fluctuations in your balances from year to year. That means you're going to have some years which look really good, which is when you get the pressure on to increase benefits. You saw that in New Jersey, you saw it in California. And then you get years which are going to look really bad, which is when they say, oh, we can't make our payments this year because everything's really, really bad. The economy's bad. So the fluctuations in the assets, I think, the accounting leads to fluctuations in the assets, which leads to this ratchet effect that you're talking about. So I think there is a link there.
Any other questions? I'd like to pose one myself, if I might, which is I'm getting a picture here of two sides. One sort of says, look, we can manage this. The other side says, no, it's a huge looming liability. I'd like to hear sort of a little more specific scenario from the crisis side. How does this crisis manifest? Is it manifest in just, huge out-of-control tax increases that become necessary year on year? Is it manifest in the squeeze on all the other areas of the budget? Because if it's true that they sort of have to pay this money, and it's true that in any given year, probably at least for that year, there would be the money cash there to put the benefits out, I don't think the crisis manifests itself in a lot of public employees not getting their pensions. At least that's one scenario you wouldn't see. So exactly what is the disaster scenario that you guys fear so much?
Well, I mean, I'm in the midst of writing something now that's going to look at the true funding burden on state and local governments. The statistic that Liz pointed out was that currently governments are paying 3.8% of their budgets towards pensions. But that's sort of the base case. You say, well, that amount, they're actually only funding 85% of what GASB rules tell them they should fund. So you gross it up by that. They're also using a smoothed asset value. If you look at the real asset value, you got to gross it up by another 15% or so. Then you say, okay, well, they should use market valuation. That essentially doubles the cost. You're going from 3.8% to something like 20% of the average state or local budget, and some places are a lot worse than that. So there's a question of the affordability in that sense, and there's a question of the appropriateness of it. The problem is if they're funding it with risky assets, it's not this recession I'm scared about, it's the next one. It's like an airplane that was flying at 25,000 feet and hits turbulence, loses 10,000 feet, that's still fine. But unless you get yourself back up again, you may not be able to survive the next hit. So I'm not saying that every state or local government is facing a crisis, but I could see a situation in which a lot of them would.
And I'd like to ask this side kind of a counterpart question, which is, let's assume these are payable, that there's not going to be some sort of fiscal and financial meltdown attributed to these pensions. The question is, sort of should we pay them, in the sense that the labor market has changed dramatically in many ways since these programs were instituted. There's a lot more flexibility, mobility, et cetera, et cetera. The typical private sector worker does not have a defined benefit plan anymore. And arguably, by sort of linking somebody to a pension, you do have the perverse incentive of keeping people past the time that they're deadwood, et cetera, et cetera. And furthermore, there is at least the perception that these are kind of a privileged class, if you like, in the states, where because of unions and politics and the rest, they're getting something everyone else isn't. Is this still an equitable risk, or are states assuming this risk in return for which they're getting something that has a kind of an intangible benefit in terms of equity anymore, or is that kind of passé?
Well, in terms of the argument that somehow public employees are grossly overcompensated, again, we have a lot of analyses of this, but just sort of as a common sense thing, we don't see that many people lining up to be high school teachers. So I don't find that, if we're looking at privileged class, I tend to think of Wall Street. I mean, I don't, CEOs. I mean, that's where I look for a privileged class, really, not so much public employees. But in terms of, are they getting something that the private sector doesn't? Sure. I mean, I think that's really unfortunate, not because they're getting something that's so great. It's that the private sector has basically lost access to defined benefit pensions. And there's a lot of polling data that suggests that people would really like something like that. And there's a lot of efforts, there have been a lot of efforts to try to rebuild something like the private pension system, presumably not in the corporate side, but perhaps on the government side, voluntary, but the idea being that people have the option to contribute some amount of money and get some sort of guaranteed benefit. And raising a point that I forget what Josh or Andrew said earlier, people don't tend to buy annuities because there's very big costs associated with them because it's administered through the private market, both administrative costs and a really big problem of adverse selection. If you could have some sort of governmental plan that had with more broad-based participation and low administrative costs, my guess is that you would have a lot more people willing to buy into annuities.
Yeah, I mean, sort of to echo the point, the average public sector pension is $20,000, $23,000 a year. So it's not this huge amount that they're getting. And I do think it's a really important part of the compensation package when you're trying to attract teachers, nurses, other public employees. And that there are efficiencies for the public sector, for the taxpayers to be providing that retirement security through a defined benefit plan, as well as rather than completely switching to a defined contribution plan. I do agree that there's a middle ground, that could be a role for choices or for a defined contribution on top of a defined benefit, so you have some piece that you can take with you if you don't stay through it, or for other changes. I mean, to me, it's, again, going back to Dean's point, it's a distraction from really sitting down and looking at the current way that we provide retirement security to public employees to say this is a gigantic crisis that's going to break every... I know you're not saying that, but it somehow sometimes gets interpreted that way in the press, and that we really need to sit down and have thoughtful conversations about how to do this, and this is a distraction by making it seem as if it's a crisis that's going to bankrupt states and local governments in the near future.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, I want to give each side to use a couple of minutes of the remaining time to sort of sum things up. And let me throw out a possible theme. If we had the public employee compensation system to start over from scratch today, would we do it with defined benefit plans like we have now? You guys can field that or ignore it or whatever. But since you went first, I'll let you go first again, and then we'll hear from this side.
I think I probably wouldn't, from the kind of employment perspective, for the reasons I talked about before of job lock. But there's a second reason where, because of the way the accounting works, it encourages state and local governments essentially to promise too much, to fund too little, and to take too much risk. the benefits, I mean, Liz cited a number of around $23,000 on average for public pension benefits. That includes a lot of people who are partial career workers who spend a lot of time in the private sector. It includes people who are a lot older who are not retiring today. If you do an apples-to-apples comparison, take the same worker, put him through a typical 401k plan and the typical public sector pension, the guaranteed benefit from the public sector pension is 4 to 5 times larger. That's the thing that we want to catch. So in the studies that Dean mentioned, because they rely on this bad accounting, simply get that wrong. It's unequivocally they get it wrong. So the question is, if you're thinking of the overall compensation package and you're thinking of how you structure the compensation, I think something that is more transparent to people, that is more portable in terms of people going from job to job would probably be a better way to do it at the workforce level, and I think would encourage better sort of macro budget outcomes in terms of how much we're promising, how much we're funding, and how much risk we're taking.
Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are two plausible reasons why you would want to offer defined benefit pensions to public sector employees, and I don't think either of them stands up. The first is that the benefit is particularly valuable for attracting talent. And in general, the rule is it's better to pay in cash than in benefits because cash is fungible unless there's some reason that the benefit is particularly valuable, whether it's a tax advantage or a structural reason that the employer has an advantage offering the benefit. But again, I'd look back to that Illinois study suggesting even if you use the aggressive 8% discount rate, employees still required a large discount beyond that to be willing to pay for a buy-up of a larger benefit, which would suggest that the inflexibility and the inflexibility and long-term nature of a defined benefit pension is not as attractive as cash payment to employees. So I think there might be specific exceptions. Police who work only a 20-year career might have a shorter time horizon and really, think when they're coming in at 20 about the attractiveness of drawing a pension at 40. But I don't think that's likely to hold true for most public employees. The other is I think the real reason that you see a lot of affinity on the left for defined benefit pensions is just a feeling that these are a good institution to have generally and that you want mechanisms for providing greater retirement security to workers. But to the extent that that's true, and we could debate how large a guaranteed income people should have in retirement, there's no reason to think that the government has a special obligation to public employees beyond other citizens to provide for their retirement above what they would actually receive as a compensation package in a negotiation, what you would need to pay them to attract talent to do the jobs. And so I think what you need to do is look to the Social Security system. I'm not a proponent of Social Security privatization. I think that you should have some defined benefit-like structure provided by the federal government to all workers, and you can discuss what the scope of that should be, but there's no argument I can see for having a special deal for public employees beyond what would be provided to them in order to maximize the quality of the talent you're attracting, and I'm not convinced that defined benefits are particularly useful for that.
Elizabeth?
Well, as you can say from what I said before about the advantages of defined benefit plans, I do think that we would include a significant share of benefits as a defined benefit plan. I mean, there are sort of experiments, right? States have given new employees a choice between defined contribution and defined benefit plans in some states, and a significant majority chose the defined benefit plan. So the argument that employees don't value these if the choice is between defined contribution and defined benefit, then they do value a defined benefit more than defined contribution. I think it's important to remember Andy's figures about the value of a defined benefit plan. Embedded within them is what discount rate you're using to figure out the current present value of that plan, so that whether you buy that or not, that increases the value in those figures. So overall, yeah, I do think defined benefit plans make sense from a retirement security point of view, from an efficiency point of view, from the point of view of bringing the costs of a current employee and their future benefits forward. But I do think it's important to have good information about what those costs are.
Well, yeah, I would argue, I mean, again, I wouldn't say we want necessarily exactly what we have, as I think Liz and I at least agreed that we would like to restructure in some ways the shape of the pensions, but I think the basic idea of a defined benefit pension makes a lot of sense. Just a couple points. Getting back to Andrew's point, the study, there's several different studies, but one that I find the best, Jeffrey Keefe at Rutgers University has done a number of studies looking at individual states and public employees in general, and he does include what states actually pay in benefits, and you could even throw in a factor saying that they're underfunded by 25%. It's not going to change that basic story, and he finds a small penalty. I don't care whether you have a penalty or premium, it's basically pretty much, they're pretty comparable, so there's not a huge difference there. So I think you have a hard time making the case that public employees are hugely overcompensated, even though obviously they do get more in pensions than their private sector counterparts. Getting to the last point, though, no, I don't think we want public sector employees to be a special privileged class. I would like to see something like a more universal pension. Again, Josh was raising Social Security. You could expand the Social Security system. That would be one way to get there. My guess is that it probably makes more sense to have something like Social Security as is a mandatory system, and then something on top of that that's a more voluntary system that people contribute to. But I think we do need a situation where people have to be better prepared for retirement. As it stands now, the huge baby boom cohort that's right now hitting retirement age, the vast majority of them do not have anywhere near what we think would be necessary to have sort of a comfortable or middle class standard of living, and that's a really big problem. So, I think we want to go the way of better pensions, not worse.
Well, thanks, Dean. As much as it pains me to give Dean the last word, that is the end of the panel. And I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I learned a lot from it. I thought it was a very illuminating discussion. And it's a tribute to this audience that we found so many earnest policy wonks in the middle of a beautiful day in Washington to sit here and listen. But it's especially a tribute to our panel that you guys were so interested in what they had to say. So let's give them a round of applause and wrap up.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.